Hi, and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we take a look at the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
This is episode 16, and today we're doing another interview, and it is with the lovely author Siobhan Clark, who wrote this awesome book, The Children of Midgard. And I'll get her to tell us all about where it's available and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to do too much of an introduction because I'm going to let her do that. So without further ado, Siobhan, welcome to Northern Myths podcast.
Hi guys, thank you very much for having me on. I'm a fan of your work and this is a real pleasure, so thank you.
Well, we're happy to have you here, and you started off right. We're big suckers for flattery, so that's great.
No problem.
So I think we'll jump right in, and so Siobhan, tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, so my name is Siobhan Clark, and I've just released my debut novel, The Children of Midgard, and it's a historical adventure in Norway, and it's set in the Viking era. And so I live in Scotland, and my dad was actually Irish, and my mum is Scottish. So growing up, I was introduced to Celtic mythology, which was really, really interesting. And my interest in mythology kind of grew from there. I got interested in Greek mythology, but eventually I just totally fell in love with Norse mythology and so many different concepts within it. One being fate, which I just find so interesting. And so it really inspired me to come up with this idea for a story and investigate it. And actually, growing up, I had brilliant kind of influences from within my family to read and investigate. And I think it was my grandfather who sparked my interest in Norse mythology to begin with. He introduced me to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and everything like that. And he had a real love of Viking history. So it was brilliant to grow up with that in my life, and it's really just continued from there over the years.
Oh, that's fantastic. Those are great gateways into this whole realm of mythology. I mean, Tolkien, I think he's one of the most influential authors ever, right? And certainly for fantasy, but everything he did was so rooted in this mythology. That's fantastic. Great way in.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a series of books you can read again and again, and as you get older you actually get more out of it and you can kind of connect it a little bit more with mythology and things like that. So it's wonderful. I couldn't recommend it highly enough.
So I'm actually kind of picturing like you sitting by your grandfather's knee, listening to him tell stories of like the gods and the myths and legends of Norse mythology. Is that kind of how it went?
Absolutely. My grandfather was just a brilliant man. He was really big in education. He worked in education. And from when we were very, very young, he kind of introduced us to lots of different kind of writers. And he actually liked to sit us down and we would go over most weekends and watch movies and things like that. So we watched some really classic kind of Viking movies when we were younger. And then he would kind of tell us a little bit more about it and really encourage us to go ourselves and investigate and find out a little bit more. So I remember being quite young, and when the school holidays came round, we would spend time with him, and then I would go to the library or something like that and look things up and try and discover a little bit more. So he was a really great man.
That's really awesome. And it's almost the traditional way of learning these stories, right? Like that's, dare I say, archetypal.
Yes,
yes. That's. I find storytelling, things like that. It's one of the most. I don't want to say primal, but there's just something so human about it that when you just sit around and tell stories and learn from, grandfathers and grandparents and parents, and just like that's how we've developed. And I don't know if we're losing some of that today, just because we've all got our face in the phone and that kind of thing, but when you're taking part of it in the moment, it just feels so right, and you actually feel connected to your ancestors like throughout history. That's awesome. I personally didn't, with Norse mythology, I didn't have that background, but it would have been like, I kind of wish I did, because it's awesome. Like it just gets ingrained in you.
Oh, definitely. I think my grandfather knew as well exactly the parts of the story to really emphasize, to capture imaginations and things like that. And I think storytelling is such a wonderful gift, and it would be just amazing if we got back into that a little bit more, just kind of in our culture. I think it's awfully easy to go online or things like that and kind of look up things very quickly and get very quick answers. But I think there's something just a little bit more personal about going into something and finding out what really interests you, and it's all about discovery, I think.
Absolutely. Now, is that part of the reason why you are a writer yourself?
Absolutely. I love to read. I always have, and kind of ever since I was very young, I kind of would come up with ideas or plots, and I would write them down. And when it came to this book, I had a very clear idea of the story I wanted to tell, and some different perspectives I wanted to get into, different points of view. So I definitely, I think it was kind of all of when I was growing up and things like that, it was a big influence on me sitting down and starting to write and putting everything kind of together as such.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. And I've always, personally, I've always wanted to be a writer, but I don't have that, I don't know if I've got the discipline, but also that all the writers I've ever met, they seem to have this almost manic need to write. And do you find that yourself, that you have to write every day or else like your day's a little wonky?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you find yourself in a flow and you don't really want to break out of it too much, so I can lose hours of the day. I can work into the evening, and time just becomes not really anything at all. I just want to get this part of the story just on paper, or to get it out. And I actually discovered that breaking away as well, and just kind of changing scene can help a lot as well. Clear your mind and get back into the story again. So what I started to do is kind of make audio notes on my phone, and then I would kind of write them down later on, and just all these different ways of, instead of just sitting constantly and writing, kind of trying to do other things to bring out more ideas. But you lose days and weeks and months to a project. It just disappears.
Oh, that's fantastic.
No, certainly I can see, in the book. I don't want to give too much away, obviously, and I think we'll give you the opportunity to kind of tell our listeners a little bit more about the book. But I certainly saw kind of a cohesive narrative throughout the book as well. Did it start kind of as that concept, or was it more organic in the sense that you're talking about here, where you get these ideas just kind of coming out of the woodwork as you're changing scenery?
I think I have some myths and some gods that I have particular interest in. And there was one myth, the death of Baldr, that really captured my imagination. I started to think about how that might have affected people if it was if when they were hearing about this myth, it would trigger off kind of things about their life that they wanted to think about. Maybe they had a particular point of view on it. So when I started imagining how the different characters would look at a myth like that and how they would treat it, it started to form into this story. I started to get a plot and characters together. And it started off as kind of maybe one small thing, and then it just grew and grew. And I was very I knew quite soon that I wanted a female lead, but I didn't want it all to be from her perspective. I wanted different kind of aspects of the Vikings and the Norse and what was going on in their lives at the time. So it came together really well. I never struggled at any point to try and fit something in. It did come quite naturally.
That's awesome. So since you brought it up, one of the questions that we like to ask is, what is your favorite myth or god? I'm going to assume it's Baldr and the death of Baldr. So what is it about that just really captures your imagination?
I guess it's a fantastic myth. It starts kind of the path or the journey to Ragnarok. Kind of it takes a little bit of speed from there. So we get kind of closer to this end of the gods and their lives as they know it. Another thing that really captured me was the grief that all the gods shared at the death of Baldr. And it was, I think, it's quite a heartbreaking kind of tale when you look at it from that point of view. That they've lost one of their own, and it's they really quite dreadfully would do anything to have him back. And I think that's probably something that we can all relate to, because we suffer loss and things in our life. So that aspect kind of really hit home with me. I found that really interesting. And then I think along with that, there's a poem. I think is it Baldr's Drummer, the Baldr's Dream, which I find really interesting as well. It's not the longest in the world, but I think the imagery from that, together with the myth, really just fascinates me. So I think that would probably have to be my favorite myth.
It's a great myth to be your favorite, and it's certainly one of my favorites as well. And no, I like that the aspect of it, the grief of the gods afterwards. That's a really interesting phase in that story. And I mean, certainly there's so many places that you could kind of fixate on within the whole story, and it's one of the most deep stories, I think, in Norse mythology, because deep in the sense of that it's old and that it would have come up naturally through one of the broader theories on it is that it would have developed as a result of the discovery of agriculture, because of the cycle of birth and death that they would see happening every year through vegetation, and how much that affected their lives. But then obviously you have, more on a literal sense, you have the idea of just people dying, and I think it had something to do with the development of reincarnation as well, the idea of reincarnation, which the Norse certainly had to in a different way than traditional reincarnation that we think of anyway in the West, which really is an Eastern idea, more like Hinduism or Buddhism. But it was more like the continuance of the family through their ancestors, something like that. But no, the part about grief, though, that's so primal and so raw, right? It definitely evokes an emotional response. Hardly any time is dedicated to that, especially in the Voluspa, which is many people's first introduction to this story, and it's only a couple of lines, but it would be so impactful, and I like that you brought that in there, and that's sort of the concept that you based the book on. If I'm understanding you right, then that whole concept and dealing with that. It's almost like you're bringing the story into how real people would relate to it, which I think is exactly what we're also kind of trying to do is look at these stories and the lessons and whatnot, and take something out of it, apply it to our daily lives, and understanding how people would have reacted to them, and so that's fantastic. That's a great point.
No, I think the myths do contain some real lessons for life, and I think definitely that when at that point where a myth would be recited to people, various people in the room could take the same story so many different ways, and then you can listen to the same story a couple of times, and each time you personally come away with something different as well. I think they're really layered. There's a lot to kind of take apart and try and understand.
Definitely. Just thinking about the grief, and because it actually doesn't get a lot of play at least in the Voluspa, but there are certain examples where that really stick out to me, like when Odin is playing riddles with Vafthrudnir, and his final riddle is, what did Odin say to Baldr before he was sent off? And I've thought about that a lot, because what does a father say to his beloved son right before he's sent to the underworld?
I think, he whispers something in his son's ear, and it could be something very, very simple, or I think it's good that it's left for us to try and decide and figure out, what that message might be.
Definitely. And it's funny, when I first read these myths, just sort of from the, Vikings are cool, this is their mythology, I'll read that. And I remember reading that, and I remember thinking, like, okay, this is a big moment, but it's not all that flashy, it's not cool just when you're reading it. But then once you get into it, like, it all starts bubbling up, and you realize that if you were hearing this, you would actually, like, feel the emotions that I guess you're supposed to feel, and recognize how epic it is. And I was thinking about, sort of from the archetypal perspective of, with Baldr dying, their whole worldview, the understanding of the world was dying with Baldr, because he was the best and the brightest of everything, and he was, either jealousy from Hod, or Hod being tricked, brought it all down. So, like, dishonesty and lies, and anyone who's listening, I think we can all, like, point to a moment in our life where our understanding of the world kind of disintegrated, and we had to, like, we kind of went through our own Ragnarok where everything just got burned to the ground, and we kind of looked at it and be like, okay, well, what do I do now? And it really, that's what I get from that story, and the grief is, like, you don't get out of bed for days kind of grief,
It's the kind of grief that really is just destroyed you, and takes a really long time to come back from, and it's as if you start to kind of realize things in a completely different light, and it's maybe not the fact that things were so wonderful before and all of that has completely changed. It's just, I think, the way that you feel is completely changed, and how you kind of handle everything else that's going to come at you in life, because that's the thing. The people that are still here have to carry on and do their best. So it's so much to it as well. And I think that I like to, for the reason that before that myth, Baldr was having dreams and about his fate, and you got a sense there that there was this kind of foreboding feeling that something terrible was coming, and it was inescapable for him. So that really kind of interested me too.
Okay, so you bring up fate a little bit here, and obviously that's something else that's deeply ingrained in your story. Now, do you see fate as being something that we're tied to, or maybe more in the sense of it's like a guideline? How do you see fate personally?
Well, it's something that I still try to understand. I really enjoy researching about it and reading a lot about it. And I think even from when I started kind of just finding out about fate within Norse mythology, it's so complex and but also quite simplistic. I think it's complex for people to try and grapple with. The idea that fate is decided, and you can't escape that. You can't change it, and you, especially for the Vikings, the idea of you were fighting for an honourable death, because the ultimate goal for a warrior was to go to Valhalla. Anything else for them would probably be seen as quite cowardly. It was not the desired path. I think fate for us now is I think it depends on how you view it and how you personally understand it. I think for myself, I think it's always a changing thing. I love the idea of fate and the concept of fate with fate in Norse mythology, and I think personally for myself, I'm still trying to understand what that means for me. And we are very, very different people in the modern age than we were back then. And I think it was a simpler time, and fate explained a lot for them. It was a good way for them to understand the world around them, and a way for to cope with life and to behave towards life and deal with everything that life was kind of challenging them with.
Yeah, for me, that was something I always grappled with, was the idea of the Norns in particular, really the personification of fate, if you want to see it that way. And I think when we covered the Norns in the Voluspa, I think my interpretation was something like, or our in general, if I'm remembering, was well, possibly they were personifications originally. It may have been some kind of a Greek influence there, that they became these actual characters. But why wouldn't they be personified? They gave characters to everything else: the sun, the moon, the most basic features of the world. They turned into these characters. But then the way they operate, if they're said to literally cut the thread of someone's life to end it, to me they almost seem like these all-powerful beings who are actually these puppet masters sort of thing, and that almost takes the fun out of it, to be honest, for me, because then they're sort of like none of the other gods are doing anything that actually matters if all they're doing is being tied to fate. And maybe it's naive of me, or maybe it's I'm looking for something other than pure determinism with fate. The way I currently view the Norns is the best understanding that they would have had of, first of all, the forces outside of human control, even on a more basic level, like gravity or the other natural forces that just kind of exist in the world, and that's how the world how the world is shaped and formed, and everything we do is kind of bound to that. So that's one aspect. But Carl Jung had a quote, and I don't think I have the exact wording right, but it was something like, unless you make the unconscious the conscious, what is left will be seen as fate. It's something like that the unconscious will be seen as fate, what you can't bring out into it. And that's really something that kind of got me there, was, these things that you do in your own life that you're doing unconsciously, whether that's because, that's some kind of aspect of your personality or something you just haven't processed, but then maybe you end up going in that path and you call it fate. And so when you apply that to something like Baldr, and of course, more generally, if you apply it to Norse mythology in general, I feel that gives a little bit of the possibility of free will, free choice, everything like that, with the understanding that fate may be decided in the sense that, if you keep going on this track, and you don't change something, that's kind of how you will end up. What are your thoughts on that? The idea of determinism, free choice, all that, as far as how they might have viewed it?
I think definitely. I think free will definitely came into the fates for them. I think they had this idea of fates, or a fated death, or a day that's going to be your eventual day of your death. And so there was an idea that if that was inevitable, if that was coming, then it would be better for you to face it head on, for every challenge that comes along your way, not to shrink away from it or to become idle or accept, my fate is to die anyway. I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm just going to let it happen. Or there's, the opposite attitude where it's, no, if this is going to happen to me, I'm going to throw myself into every situation that's coming. And if that turns out to be my fated day of death, fine. Okay, I met it head on. That's wonderful. And then when I started kind of reading a little bit more and researching more about fate, and when I started trying to incorporate it into my characters and things like that, I actually started to think of fate as like maybe different stages of growth for us. So I guess when you look at the Norns, you've got you've got Skuld and you've got Verdandi and Urd. So I guess for children, I think I started to think of them as they only live in the present. It's day to day. A child doesn't really think of their future or their past very much at all. They're just they're caught up in their own kind of world. When you get a little bit older, you start looking towards your future, and you really want to create a life for yourself. And then as you get older yet, you become reflective, you look back in your past and try and understand the decisions that you made and things like that. So I think definitely free will allowed people to make decisions, to make choices within their life, but with the understanding that anything that they did wasn't going to change the end result. Your fated kind of death is just that.
That's awesome. I actually hadn't thought of that, but that definitely fits for the ideas of fate, and even I'm trying to remember the maiden, the wife, and the crone, that the different stages of life. I hadn't thought of it like that before, but that's quite interesting. And even like when you are looking back on your life, or stewing over things that have happened already, a lot of times they'll call that like wool gathering. Like, oh, I'm just wool gathering, and like, yeah, that with the whole fate weaving through that, just I love that interpretation of it, or those ideas. I hadn't thought of that before.
It kind of it was a gradual kind of thing that I started to understand, and it made sense for me and for the characters and things like that, and where I was going with the story. But I think the idea that ultimately in the end, I mean, Odin met his fate, even though he made attempts to change it, that it couldn't be done. Still, Ragnarok came and that sort of thing. So I think can sometimes be quite strange for us to understand, just because it's a different world that we live in now. But it doesn't make it any less interesting to read about or to try and understand.
Yeah, they're complex ideas, very, very complex ideas, and I mean, I think anyone can have their own interpretation of how you view life, really, and I mean, I think it's important that it's a personal understanding today, but back then, I think you're right that how it would give them, a sense of a purpose and peace. It's a great attitude if what they were really doing was making the most of their life, despite understanding that they are going to die one day, and it might not be great. I mean, Odin, as an example, I think what he was really doing after determining that Ragnarok was going to happen, because I think that's his main point in going to all of these places, asking about what people know, going into the underworld to speak to Ceres, right? I think that's all, like you were saying, the goal of finding out what's going to happen. But then after that point, it turns into, okay, now he's going to accumulate soldiers for this final battle. He's going to do everything he can to ensure that his people survive after Ragnarok. And what do you think of that? I think that's something like if you have the ability to change the outcome of what goes on after your death, is that really fated?
I think the for most people, they wouldn't have any idea of what their end fate would be, and Odin managed to find out, but I think for other people it would have involved definitely belief in kind of mysticism or magic, or to talk to a seeress, or to try and discover an inkling about what your fate is going to be. But kind of in the same way that the message is that so you don't know what your fate is currently. Even if you did, it's not going to change anything. So do you really need to know? You can continue to live your life without this knowledge. So, and then when I was kind of reading up a little bit more about fate, there was the idea that if you run away from it or you try to avoid it, your life becomes more chaotic, more fraught, and everything becomes more unsettled. And that really doesn't lead anywhere good either. So that was really interesting to me because, again, with Odin, I feel that there's a bit of a message in there that things became incredibly chaotic, and even with amassing an army to fight at Ragnarok, it didn't change things at all. And I wonder, when I was kind of reading about that, what if he hadn't done that, if that hadn't been the case, would Ragnarok have been exactly as it did become? Did it become more chaotic because they tried to do something about it or to change it? So yeah, it's the more you get into it and the more you read it and you think, oh my gosh, okay, there's another way to kind of look at this. So yeah.
Definitely, it makes me think of something that Jordan Peterson said, and that we can't seem to go an episode without mentioning him, even in interviews. He talked about, I think it was actually like the last class of his Maps of Meaning course, which we highly recommend. But he says, you're going to have to pay for everything that you do and everything that you don't do. And really the best option that you have is you get to pick your poison. And I kind of get the feeling that's kind of what it is with fate, is that you get to pick whether you're going to fight against it as Odin is doing, or if you're kind of going to go blindly into it and just sort of see what happens and that kind of thing. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other, selections of poison through that spectrum, but with Odin, I think he's like, okay, well, if everything that we've built is going to get destroyed, well, I'm at least going to try my best to preserve it for as long as I can, before I get eaten by the wolf.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that Jordan Peterson is incredibly interesting. And when I was researching, I came across lots of lectures that he had done. And I think it was an interview that he was giving, and something that kind of stuck with me and also kind of tied up with kind of Norse mythology as well, and the idea of fate. It was the idea that, you shouldn't shrink away from fate. You should face challenges. It makes you grow as a person. And that it's this idea of becoming idle, that the world around you becomes smaller. And it's more kind of, you could say it's just healthier aspects of people to expand their worlds, to face challenges, to not kind of give in, because life just doesn't, afford you that chance to. It's always throwing something at you. I guess that kind of, it made sense to me when I was listening to that, especially kind of tying into the idea of fate in Norse mythology. I guess they had to accept that challenges were going to face them, and things were incredibly hard, a lot harder back then. Lives were a lot shorter as well, so you had to make sure that you lived well, you lived honorably, and you did the best that you had with the life that you had.
Yeah, I think that ties exactly into how my interpretation of Odin's actions leading up to and in Ragnarok are that he is trying to do the best with this bad situation. I think it's also valid to say that maybe he's running away from it, but I think it's also possibly that the world would not have been reborn in such a positive state without him doing everything he could to counteract the armies of destruction. The most negative, malevolent version of the unknown and of chaos that was essentially conceivable. Maybe he did just enough to neutralize it, and then the world was able to come back anew. And if he didn't make those preparations, maybe the world would have essentially just been gone, and humanity, the gods, wouldn't have been able to return the way that they did. That's maybe, again, I'm being a little bit hopeful. Maybe I'm reaching for something there, but the message I take from that is that, if you do the best that you can to ensure that you're going to leave a good legacy, because that's a whole other side to Fate that I think was important for them, was the idea of leaving a legacy. If you do that to the best of your ability, then maybe it's just going to leave the world a better place and be easier. And I think that it makes it all worthwhile. That example shows that it's all worthwhile to live the best life that you possibly can. And in Odin's case, I think it really, on a practical level, turns into, okay, let's try and counteract this dark forces at Ragnarok sort of thing. And maybe I'm not going to survive, but my sons are going to survive. The next generation is going to survive. And I like that a lot, and I've certainly brought that into my own understanding of the world and of Fate. What do you think of maybe that idea as opposed to him running away from Fate, as you put it?
No, absolutely, I would agree with that. I think that he was known for his wisdom, and I think definitely he was acting honorably. I think that he absolutely was doing everything to give the world that they had created, that they knew, all the worlds, the realms, the absolute best chance of something surviving and not completely the end. And it is a cycle and things like that. But when you're faced with the unknown, you have to do absolutely everything that you can to preserve something of what you were and what you are. So I would absolutely agree with that.
For sure. I was just thinking, when we're talking about Norse mythology, it's actually a very hopeful mythology because there is that rebirth after. But I'm thinking there are, like on a very personal level, there's a lot of people who sort of face their own Ragnarok and don't get reborn after, and then you'll often see either sort of a slow withering or like that's it, and it's a sort of a dramatic end, and it's terrible to see. And I think the idea of leaving a legacy, even for your future self, and that, okay, if I do all of these things that I know are, they produce order and they help orient myself in the world and the unknown. If I can, if it's good enough, it'll remain after everything gets torn down. I'll still be able to orient myself with those few things and rebuild the world. But it's definitely not a sure thing. It's if you walk down the street of any, at least in Canada, of an urban center, you'll see a lot of people who haven't been able to recover from, their own sort of personal Ragnarok.
Absolutely. I think there are definitely some demons that people cannot escape. They try their hardest, and that's their eternal kind of struggle to make sense of their life and what it's become, whether they accept that or they try to move on from it. And I think life is such an extremely complex thing. And I always think to myself that even just talking about people or describing people or what they're like or anything like that, you can only really give it a very, very brief description. And definitely things are passed on, and we remember, and we always look to people who are in our past or things like that for, you think to yourself, well, how would they deal with this? Is that a clue to how I might be able to deal with this? And, things like that. Yeah, I think it's definitely incredibly complex.
For sure. I mean, if these ideas weren't complex, we wouldn't be wrestling with them the way they are. And I know personally, this is something I've changed my mind on my view of Fate so many times over the last certainly years, but even in the last few months, I mean, certainly reading this mythology and all this stuff is a catalyst to thinking about these deep questions. But it's almost like there's even conflicting ideas of how this all works in your daily life. How do these ideas affect your daily life? Do you bring that into your daily life at all?
I guess probably like everybody else, so much that some days I guess you think you don't think about it too deeply. You don't have to. Everything's going fine. Then you'll get times where particularly more of a struggle, and you do find yourself thinking about fate. You start questioning: is this what my life is going to be? Is there an end to this particular moment? Or and you can't. There are points where you maybe think, I can't actually see myself getting over this. What's going to happen from here on in? And I definitely do think about fate a lot. I think we all have really interesting lives, and we all have big things that we need to try and deal with within our lives. And I think that we try and deal with it as best we can. And lots of people have, I guess, a kind of structure or a belief that will help them to do that. Myself, I think that I do think about fate a lot. I think, I do think about, well, what is the end result of all of this going to be? And then it goes on from there, and it grows and it grows and it grows. My ideas on it change all the time. I think it's a continual kind of continual aspect of life. I think it's going to continue to keep changing for me. I'm not sure. A couple of years from now, I might be thinking again and looking at it a completely different way. Certainly the last couple of years, the more research I've put into it and finding out more kind of modern thoughts on it, and psychology and things like that, I've changed the way that I think about fates now as well.
Well, yeah, hearing about all this, the understanding of psychology in particular, I like that you brought that up, was definitely critical for me to start exploring these ideas. But what really gets me is that it seems like ideas that were first being discovered by, say, Freud and Jung in the 1800s, early 1900s, something like that. These are ideas that were expressed by these myths. It's just kind of hidden. It's not even hidden. It's just more like you have to understand the way they would have expressed themselves. And I mean, another thing we can't really go an episode without saying is that we're certainly not experts in all this, but it seems like reading the myths from the archetypal perspective seems to unlock the psychological understanding of how they would have viewed the world. And I mean, I'm certainly not implying that everything within Norse mythology or any other mythology really is going to exactly be explained by our understanding of archetypes that were built in the 1800s, 1900s, even up to the modern day. We're certainly going to have a different understanding of life and the world than they did, but it still gives us clues at how to interpret them in a way that goes beyond the narrative itself, because if you look at only the narrative of some of these stories, they can be really confusing, and some of them look really downright terrible as far as a life lesson. But no, I think you have to take the modern understanding that you develop and look at these stories from that perspective and try and understand it, and then it turns into a feedback loop, like you're saying. Do you have any other aspects from these mythologies that you view similarly, that you maybe bring into your daily life in that regard as well? Lessons from these stories?
Yeah, I think I really like the idea that you should. The idea of honor is a really interesting idea to me. I think it's really important to live your life as well and as you possibly can, and to treat the people in your life as well as you possibly can. think that's one thing that comes through when you kind of read the myths. There a lot of kind of trouble and strife comes from attitudes and particular ways of thinking, and really makes it clear to people that kind of greed really is not going to get you anywhere at all. And I think that was something I tried to explore in the book as well, is a kind of negative attitude invites negativity upon you. And if you try and strive to look positively on life and give it everything you've got in this positive sense, it can only work out better for you. And it doesn't mean to say that things are going to get easier. It's just, I think it's an attitude that you need to try and develop. So I kind of take that away from the myths as well.
Definitely, I guess, before this becomes like a podcast on The Secret or something like that. But it's very true. If you're always looking for the negative things in life, you're going to find them. It's not hard, but you're going to focus on it. It's kind of like if you're looking for, like, if we were all to go away from this looking for green cars over the next week, we would see so many green cars, and we'd wonder, how did we never see this before? Like, it's because you're looking for it. So if you're looking for the positive, you're going to find it, and it'll also just make you more resilient. And I think we do see that in the myths, that again, it's kind of your fate, and it's kind of that unconscious aspect that if you unconsciously are looking at things negatively, then of course you're going to be seeing negative things. You're not going to know why they're always happening to you, and then you're going to get frustrated because your sacrifices aren't being honored, even though you're looking at it negatively. And then before you know it, you're Cain and killing people.
Yeah,
and It sounds simple and kind of glib, but that's like actually how it goes, like that's how people get bitter, and I
think when I'm hearing all this, the story that I think most parallels this is Odin having his eye in the well of Mimir, and he's got his eye in the well of Mimir because that comes up in Jotunheim, in the land of the unknown, essentially. But he doesn't put his eye in Fergelmir, which is that root near Helheim. It's under the world, and it's really where all that chaos is forming and seething. And certainly there would be a lot of potential there, but there would be a lot of negativity and danger there. And I think that would be the same sort of thing in that if you are looking for the negative, and if you're putting yourself in there, you've really got one eye in hell, as far as I'm concerned. In hell with one L, but the symbolic hell, the underworld. And I definitely don't think you want to do that.
No, I know Nietzsche has that great line about gazing into the abyss, and the abyss also gazes into you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, like that'll keep you up at night.
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, did you want to, because I think we sort of dove into this conversation here, but did you want to give any sort of a little summary or primer on the book? I don't think we have kind of covered that yet.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, we've been talking about themes in it, but we haven't actually talked about the book yet, so which we probably should. We'd probably kick ourselves if we didn't. So, yeah.
I actually do this a lot. I end up kind of start talking about an aspect of the book. I get more involved in that than I do anything else. But yes, no. So as I said, it's a historical adventure, and it's set in Norway in the Viking era, and it centers around a young woman called Liv, and she is on the run from a group of Jomsvikings who have been sent by a jarl, and she has been made the guardian or the protector of a child in Midgard. And there's a legend associated with the child that says he could be the progeny of Odin. And there's a ring that she has to protect as well. So she confronts many aspects of her life. She's always looking to her future. She is wondering what the fate is going to be for her, but what her involvement in other people's lives, how that's going to affect their fate. Is she ultimately responsible for that? And then people that she believes that have died, perhaps haven't. They make a reappearance again, and she has to try and work out trust, and ultimately, at the end of the day, she only wants to fulfill her role of protection of this child. So in the book, we do a lot of traveling, and there's a sense of exploration of the myths of their lives and things like that. And I've included some really interesting things that I find interesting in Viking life at the time, such as the Joms Vikings. I found incredibly interesting to read about what an order of men, and I try as well to for every kind of idea or such as the Joms Vikings, I'll try and show them in different lights so that there's not just one kind of ideas. It's up to you to decide, as well with them, the legends and the myth that they talk about in the book as well. So it's a good adventure. It's pretty fast paced, and I think if you have an interest in mythology and in the Vikings, then definitely it's worth trying. It's a story I loved writing. So yeah.
Well, that's great. I certainly agree with that it's fast paced. Absolutely agree with that. It certainly is action packed and moving from one scenario to another. I'm curious how the legend of this child and this ring, how you came up with that and developed that for your story.
Okay. Well, I loved reading about Odin and him coming in, or kind of traveling and journeying across the realm of Midgard. And so he had many children, and I started to think about what people might feel if they could identify who one of his children were at this time for them. How do we react to that? And the idea that I came up with was pretty simple, that people who had an impure heart, or they really only have their self-interests at heart, really would only view the legends or this idea of Odin's child as something that they could gain from. And then the opposite of that is people who really only wanted to live well, to live honourably, would try and protect that legacy. So those were the kind of the ideas that I started to think about when I was forming this storyline.
Oh, that's awesome. Just continuing on about the story, I guess, what do you have any like authors that you look to and think like, oh man, I want to be like them? Or when you're writing that, like, in Canada, kids, they'll play hockey, right? And they'll pretend to be like a hockey player, and I'm going to be this guy. When you were writing, were there any authors where you thinking like, oh, I'm just like, Yeah.
I was introduced to a lot of really great writers, and I have my uncle to thank for this as well, because he had a great love for Ernest Hemingway, and he introduced that to me when I was in, high school, I think it probably was. And I became completely obsessed. I loved the way that he wrote about people and their flaws, and some of them were very, very tragic characters, and the way that they lived their life. I found a world that you're completely drawn into, and I know that has completely nothing to do with Vikings or anything like that at all. But I just love the sense of layers and different kind of aspects of people, and I loved that he was so simplistic in the way that he wrote as well. I just thought it's such an amazing gift. But I've always really enjoyed stories that, like Tolkien with Lord of the Rings, there's so many layers to it, and so well developed that you can completely get drawn into it. And I actually, a recent writer that I really like is Karen Maitland, and she wrote a brilliant book called The Company of Liars. And it's a medieval kind of thriller, I guess you could call it. It's like a murder kind of mystery thing, but it's got a lot of mythology in it, which is wonderful. And it centres on basically the entire cast of characters lying to each other and every lie unraveling as it goes on further in the story. So I think I've always been kind of really drawn to kind of stories that really layer up so well. And then again, adventure stories as well. I think my grandfather introduced me to Damas when I was very young as well. So I was reading things like The Man in the Iron Mask and Three Musketeers, probably when I was far too young, but I thought it was brilliant. So like I'm really open though to reading anything at all. I enjoy it so much that I think everything deserves a good shot. So yeah.
Those are great influences to have. Did you have any books in particular that were influences into this, The Children of Midgard, or and I'll extend that to fiction or nonfiction? Any particular influences on your research, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have so many non-fiction books; it's ridiculous. But I have a history of the Vikings by Gwyn Jones, which is really great, and it's quite dense. But if you break it down, then there's some really fascinating kind of parts in there, and I really like that. And then I've got a lot of mythology books, which are wonderful. But I actually started listening to. I think it was a series of lectures that were given on the history of the Vikings, and I think it was by Great Courses, which is an amazing one. And it talked a lot about Viking kind of exploration and the routes that they took, when they were sailing and things like that, which was amazing. It was really good for the Joms Viking kind of angle of it as well. And then there was a book called The Sea Wolves, and I think that it's maybe. I'm trying to remember the author, but that was another fascinating read. So I have a lot that I draw from, absolutely. So.
I envy your ability to be so well read. Sometimes I find I can't find the time to even get through the one or two books that I'm trying to read at any one time. So that's fantastic. It's obvious that you've got a lot of influences playing around here in the book, and I think it's really interesting that you really developed your own fully plausible setting that. To really play with these characters and how they would have reacted in a situation like that, because certainly the story that you develop, I suppose it's not directly something that's documented, but it's plausible. It's something that certainly could have been there, and we're at a disadvantage. Well, we have such an advantage in that a lot of history was written down, and that was fantastic. We're certainly better off for having the sagas and all of that was written down. But I'm sure there's just so much that really got lost, and I mean there are so many stories where I wish there was some elaboration on. Even just specific details, how they fit together. I think we were just talking about the creation of the world in our interview with Noah from History of Vikings, and I think I was just saying that it would be so nice if that in particular could piece together some of the characters a little bit better, because it's almost like, okay, here's this cow, here's this giant, and this is sort of how it all works. But I'm sure that they had an understanding of how they related and worked together so much better. So either way, that's just to say that I think what you did there in the story here to bring out something that would be fully plausible and then just sort of play with that. That's a great way to develop a story, I think. And I like how that was the way that you went about creating that.
I think I really kind of really did a lot to try and understand what daily life was going to be like at that time as well, and not make it too fantastical. I think it's probably a personal niggle of mine sometimes when you're reading an adventure novel or something. And you're thinking, no, I don't. I'm not. No, I wouldn't necessarily make that decision or run with that or anything. So I was trying to be as kind of as true to as I could to how people might have felt and dealt with things at that time.
Yeah, there's definitely no point where when I was reading it, I was like, oh, this character wouldn't have done that. What's going on? Because that's one of my pet peeves when, and it usually happens around like an ending where the author will sort of shoehorn a character trait that like the character has displayed like the exact opposite for the whole book, and there's been no mention of like personal growth or change over, and they just shoehorn something in to make it like a happy ending. Oh, it drives me nuts. I like if it's going to be a tragedy, it's going to be a tragedy because of that flaw that they just can't seem to shake, you know? So I definitely appreciated that you didn't shoehorn anything. Everyone was themselves throughout the whole story. I also really enjoyed that, like you're saying, you didn't pretty it up. Like, I also hate historical fiction that kind of sanitizes things, but with this, you could kind of like, you could smell the horses and the muck and just all that kind of stuff. And as they're journeying, I can imagine that just how smelly they would be. Like it wasn't pleasant, and that really came across. So I definitely appreciated that as well.
I think I love description. When I'm reading, I really love to form an idea in my head of even the scenery that they're looking at, and give the whole picture of the character. And I think, I think probably it's. I definitely enjoy kind of just the reality of it more than kind of everybody was wonderful and everybody was walking around looking fantastic all the time, because they wouldn't have been at all. It was completely the opposite. But I think that was one thing that I really enjoyed researching about was like daily life, and so how clothes were made and things like that, or food, everything like that, because they were kind of, their world was completely different from ours in that respect, and it would have been, a completely different place. It would have smelled completely different. It would have looked completely different. How people viewed things being attractive were totally different as well. So, I think it helped anyway for the story.
Yeah, and another aspect that I enjoyed. Well, first of all, in terms of the descriptiveness. So when I was doing most of my reading, I was on vacation or just coming back from a trip to Norway, and they have a fantastic museum there. This open air museum in Oslo that has buildings from all over Norway, including the areas of Norway that you essentially were covering there. And so I could see that kind of the authenticity there. I could view it from these little cabins that were hardly more than like a single room sort of thing, but I could actually see that kind of happening there. And it's I like that we have that connection to the past where we can see this historical the history's being preserved by the people who lived it, right? And I don't necessarily know if you had these exact things in your mind when you were creating it, but I certainly saw the parallel, and it fit with what I was seeing there in those museums. So I think that that worked out really well. But
I'm glad.
yeah. The other aspect I liked as well was how you handled the beliefs of the characters, and it was almost like they were operating in a world that could have been essentially what we would know as like a mundane atheist world sort of thing, except they had these beliefs, and any interaction with those beliefs, it certainly didn't bring me out of the fact that this is like a plausible world, that this is actually how this is how the world appears to work from a scientific perspective sort of thing, but they still had these interactions. And I mean, I don't want to, no spoilers or anything like that, but the interactions and the way that they handled their belief was really good. How did you develop the way that they would have expressed their belief?
So I thought about different aspects, I guess, of their life at the time. So as well as having belief in the gods and everything like that, the reality was you still had to get up every day and you had everything to do. So if you were fishing, you had to go and do that. And if you were farming, you were tending the land and the animals and everything like that. And so your belief would I tried to weave it in together. So one didn't take over the other, so that one just wasn't an afterthought of, something that they were doing that day. I tried to do it in such a way that it was when kind of people were talking to each other and explaining something to one another as well, which kind of tied in with the whole idea of kind of everything, all the stories being told orally and things like that. Just try to keep it simplistic as well in that respect. I didn't want to overcomplicate anything, the interactions or anything that was going on with any of the characters.
That's awesome. Just going a little bit more broadly, do you have a favorite book, or maybe books I'd like? You don't have to just say one, but
yeah, absolutely. So I guess definitely, I would, like I said, the Company of Liars is a wonderful book. So I really enjoyed that. And one of my favorite books is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. And it's a really, really tragic story. And the characters are so flawed in that book. It's one that I've read a few times over the years, and every time I go to it, I'm again kind of learning something new, or I'm thinking about it slightly differently. And when I read it probably for the first time, about 20 years ago, believe it or not, and it's a book that stayed with me. So I definitely would recommend that to people. And I think as well, I'm really into exploration and adventure and things like that. So also in non-fiction. So I spend a lot of time kind of reading that kind of genre as well. So I have so many books. I guess I still love reading the sagas as well. I just recently got a lovely volume of the Saga of the Icelanders by, I think it's Jane Smiley. It's a beautiful book. It's hand-cut paper and everything, and that has a lovely feel to it. So that's the book I'm currently into at the moment. Oh,
that's awesome. And where can people pick up your book?
So yeah, I guess Amazon, and it's there, so that's kind of easily accessible for everybody. It's also in kind of general bookstores and things like that. So like Barnes and Noble or Waterstones or those types of stores. So, but for ease, I would say probably everyone can get access to Amazon. So
definitely.
Yeah.
That's great. Are you currently working on anything new? Do you want to talk about any projects you're working on?
Sure, yeah. There's a lot happening. The last couple of months have just exploded in a way that I can't believe. I'm currently editing a manuscript at the moment, which again is along the lines of Norse mythology. But what I've decided to do this time, it's a collection of short stories, and it's from the perspective of a grandfather talking to various members of his family and sharing stories. So that was incredibly, I took so much joy in doing that. It was a lot of fun. And I've got a lot more signings and things coming up, but next weekend I'm actually going to a Viking festival. This is the first one that I've ever been to, so I'm really, really excited about that. So we've got a really exciting project happening at the Viking Festival as well that we've developed. That I'm not sure how much I can say about it because it's not happened yet.
For sure.
But it's involving so the Haitian Viking Festival. It's like, I think this is its third year now, and it's actually becoming one of the biggest, most popular festivals in the UK, which is just wonderful. The town of Haitian itself has got a really rich kind of Viking history to it, and there's going to be a reenactment camp there, which I'm so interested in going to see. I am desperate to see people demonstrating kind of crafts and things like that, or kind of blacksmithing, and we're going to have some carpenters there, if I can speak. There's also going to be archery, which is looking really fantastic. There's going to be battle reenactments as well, which I've never seen this, so I'm really excited to go and see what it's going to be like. So yeah, I'm very excited to have been invited there because it's just so different, and it's going to be good to speak to people that have got real interest in this as well. It'd be absolutely fantastic.
Geez, I'm kind of jealous that you have that festival. That sounds like a good time.
Yeah, I think it'll be really good. There's some lectures happening as well, so I'm going to try and get to some of those. And I think it's going to be kind of lectures on the Viking kind of history in the UK. And then I think we're going to talk a little bit about some Irish Viking history as well. So the Haitian Council and the whole kind of all of the organisers have done so well in making it just, it's going to be a really, really fantastic time. Yeah, they've done an incredible job.
Those are great topics to cover on their own. The influence on the UK, on Ireland. Yeah, that's. I'm sure you know you being from Scotland, having Ireland and all that. You mentioned the Celtic mythology kind of in there as well. I'm actually curious. Is that something you bring into your writing currently at this point, or is it more just the Norse and Viking at the moment?
Well, there are a couple of things that when I was reading Celtic mythology, I could see that there were similarities in Norse mythology as well. One of the particular things was this idea of a fetch or a filger, and that really interested me. And I guess that there are a lot of kind of similar ideas, probably because of kind of location and things like that as well, that there's going to be kind of not an overlap but similar kind of ideas going on. There's a lot, but Celtic mythology is again, it's really, really complex, and depending where you are, so it's, you know, Scottish Celtic mythology is slightly different to Irish again, and that's slightly different to Welsh and slightly different to England as well. So but it makes for incredible kind of resource for stories and things like that, and it can really, from a point of view of being a writer, it gives you a lot to work with. So I think definitely there's a lot more in Celtic mythology I want to go back to and try and see more similarities between it and Norse mythology too.
Well, we're certainly open to Celtic mythology. So if you ever do anything kind of within that sphere, that's 100% something that we want to talk about, because you know with our name and all that, we try to open ourselves up to as many mythologies as we possibly could, and I think we've got the Norse, we got the Finnic mythology currently, but I think we wanted Slavic, Baltic, Celtic to all be options, and so if you ever go in that direction, happy to talk about that.
Absolutely.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, definitely. I'm really excited. I got my copy of the Kalevala, so I can't wait to get into that. I'm really, really looking forward to it. So it's so interesting. I think there's so many mythologies and cultures and things like that that are just interesting, and it doesn't just stop with Norse for me, or Celtic mythology or anything. I just keep kind of expanding, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the time.
I certainly know what that's like. It seems like when we started this, I mean, it was all so simple. We would just read this one book, but then now it just seems like there's so much to it. And I mean, we might be going a little bit slowly, but it takes time to dig into all this stuff properly, right? So.
Yeah, no, I think what you guys do is your work is absolutely fantastic, and I like that. You can. Well, I have a copy of Jackson Crawford's the Poetic Edda as well to kind of follow along with it. And I think what you do is you are kind of, it's such an incredible insight. It's something new. It's definitely things that different ideas to me. I think it's what you're doing is fantastic, and just keep on doing it. It's incredibly interesting.
Yes, we'll say more good stuff about us. It's like please stop, please stop. Yeah,
No, really, thank you.
yeah.
Though
Thank
that's
you.
much appreciated.
I think we're just surprised that anyone listens to us at all. So
Oh no, honestly, I think it's I like the pace that you go at as well. I have to say, I like him. I listen to him kind of my iPhone and things like that, and I find myself listening, and then I'll stop, and I'll be like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that makes sense, and I'll make a note of it and things like that. So I think definitely you're definitely doing all the right things. So yeah, I can understand why you have such a great fan base.
Well, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's one of those things. I don't know much more to say than that, but really appreciate it and glad to have you along. Not only listening to the show. Certainly, thank you for reaching out to us originally. You were the first person really who reached out to us about possibly coming on the show, and we always knew we wanted to have guests, but it was just really something else that someone would reach out to actually see if we would talk to them, and I mean that was it's always been something that I personally really it meant a lot to have you reach out, and I'm glad we finally got you on the show to have a conversation, and I think so far it's been great. So
yeah, definitely. This is. I'm sure we could do a podcast that would go for 5 hours. It'd probably help. I know for myself, these are the types of conversations I like to have, like with a pint of beer or a dram of scotch. Yeah. But
oh, absolutely.
I think we might wrap it up a little bit here. So just to reiterate to everyone, you can find the Children of Midgard on Amazon, and definitely check it out. It's definitely a fast-paced story. Set during the Viking Age in Norway. I really don't want to give too much away, but it's kind of a rollicking ride. You can put that on the next time it's printed, you put that on the cover. Dan Larrabee, Northern Myths Podcast, rollicking ride.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll definitely be in touch. Oh, and I guess before we go, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, sure.
Like social media and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, and it's under Siobhan Coda. So that's SIOBHANCODA. There is a Facebook page for the Children of Midgard. There is a website, and that is siobhancoda.wordpress.com. And also my publisher, John Halstead at Abella Publishing, where actually he is a fantastic resource for Viking and mythology books. So he's absolutely great. So you can also get in touch with me there.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for coming on our show and talking to us and reaching out to us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we're going to have to do this again for sure.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed every single minute of it. So I would love to absolutely have another discussion again. That would be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk again.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this episode of the Northern Myths Podcast. Before we go, sort of our normal stuff. Again, thank you to Siobhan Clark for coming on the show. Also, as always, thanks to Dr. Jordan Peterson for inspiring all of this. And you can check out his courses on YouTube, which we've got a link to his YouTube channel, as well as his biblical lectures, which are really the inspiration for what we're doing. You can find us on YouTube. Just look for Northern Myths Podcast. Virtually every podcasting service, Podbean, iTunes,
Spotify,
Stitcher.
Yes.
Yeah, Stitcher. I think, and pretty much any of the other ones. I mean, yeah, we're there. Then, of course, there's Facebook, which is at Northern Myths, and Twitter at Northern Myths, and then I'm on there personally at NorthMythDan and at NorthMythLuke for Luke. Instagram at Northern Myths Podcast. I think that's all the social media that's out there. And is there anything you'd like to end off with, Luke?
Yep. Please do subscribe and share. Leave us a review. Leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Everyone who reaches out on Twitter, Facebook, we try and get back to you. So please do that. And other than that, I think, leaving you with our final thought to go out in the words of Carl Jung and go find the myth you're living.
All right. This has been Northern Myths Podcast. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.